Welcome back. In our previous section, we talked about understanding dashboard. In this section, we're going to focus on preparing and creating dynamic data visualization. So we're going to talk about some of these steps that we need to take to create powerful dynamic visualizations. And when I say dynamic here, I'm referring principally to time elements and how we can use those effectively. We're going to take a look in this section at basic overview of dynamic visualizations and then move into videos on using time elements and why they are so important. And then we'll move on to actually constructing some dynamic visualizations, followed by actually animating the displays based on what we've created. So a quick overview. As I mentioned, typically, I'm using the term dynamic to indicate time-based visualizations. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. We could have other elements that cycle in and out of a visualization, but generally speaking, we're looking along a time continuum when we're building these sorts of visualizations, generally from oldest to newest. We need to build these visualizations in a way that shows meaningful changes. So in other words, if we've got data sets where the data really only changes on an infrequent basis, we're not going to want to build the dates at the day level or the minute or hour level. We're going to want to go to a higher level that's more relevant to the context of the data. And then finally, simple animation, once we've gotten the right time frames and all of our other data in place, can be a very effective way to tell, especially explanatory data stories, where the viewer can actually sit back and watch, much in the form of a miniature movie. So with that, let's move into our video on using time elements. So what you're going to learn in this video, number one, why time is such a critical component for many data visualizations, how we use it effectively. I mentioned also how to identify the most appropriate time period, and it's really relative to the granularity of the data and how often that data is likely to change. And then we're going to talk about actually the nuts and bolts of building time into a dynamic visualization. And then we can also use time as a filter element. So there are several reasons why we should use time elements. It's very difficult to see in many data sets when we aggregate them what's really happening. Are things changing? Are they going up, down? Are they staying the same? Are the patterns seasonal or cyclical? And using time can give us this sort of context to a data visualization, and it makes us much more informed about the data set. And then in addition to being able to create dynamic visualizations using this time, we can give users the ability to restrict or limit the time period within the data to what's most important to them. So to summarize why we spend time using time elements, without using time when it's available to us, we're really just looking at snapshots of a given point in time or an aggregate data set. So it's not particularly powerful relative to what it could become. So if we want users to have a really concrete and complete understanding of data set patterns, it's really useful to give them time ranges to highlight these patterns. Let's look at an example in Tableau Public for how we can use time to make a compelling visualization that we can then turn into a dynamic visualization as well. And then we're going to use time to filter the data. So it's got multiple uses in this case. For starters, we can see time in typical fashion along the x-axis. So we've got a time series, and we'll typically show those as either a line graph or a bar chart, column chart in this case, going from left to right, so oldest to newest values. Very typical format for time series. And what we can do using Tableau Public, we've presented this picture of the entire graph of this US government budget data Now let's turn it into a dynamic value or dynamic visualization. And in this case, we've got the ability to animate. We're doing this in Tableau Public. It can be done in other data visualization platforms as well. And what that does, it gives the user the ability to see what's happening with the data set over time in a slightly more compelling fashion. We end up in the same place as when we presented a static visualization, but now we've added a little layer of engagement for the user. What we can also do with time, I've created a decades version, so we've rolled years into decades, and now we can start removing some of the data. The user can do this to really begin focusing on different points within the data, narrow that 55 or 60-year data set down, and begin to probe and explore a bit more. So we've combined time in two fashions. We've got it along the x-axis, and now we've got it as a filter as well. So it's very powerful to use time in data visualization. So to summarize, time is very essential, as we just saw, for building dynamic visualizations. You can use categorical elements, but typically time is a very interesting way to create a dynamic visualization. Users can watch things unfold from the past into the present and sometimes even into the future using time. So that gives us context and allows users much greater understanding of key patterns. And then, as we just showed, we can also use filters, which then give the users a greater level of interaction with your data visualization.